Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third episode of our Ask CESO webinar. We're excited that you're with us, and we've definitely got a few people on, and we hope we'll have more joining. Our last two episodes of the Ask CESO webinar were about redoing your website and about storytelling for school PR, so check those out in YouTube and see what those were about. Today, we're going to be talking about crisis communications, and we've got some of our great experts to go through some of the common questions about this. But first, let me tell you who we are. CESO is the Center for Effective School Operations, and we provide support services to school districts. We're from the communication team for CESO, but CESO also offers transportation, finance, HR, and technology services. Now I'm going to ask Justin to jump in and help me kick this off.
Good morning. How's it going?
Good. You?
I'm doing good. Just hanging out, and we're excited for today's session. So let me tell you a little bit about how this is going to go. This is your first Ask CESO session. This is just a conversation. This is a Q&A. So we've got some questions that we've heard frequently from clients and from people that we work with every day that we've brought to this forum to talk with our experts about. But also the cool thing about it being a live one is if you are watching, you have the opportunity or seeing those, sharing those into the to the folks who are on the panel, and we will be able to get those questions in front of everybody for you so we can answer your questions as we go. One of the cool things this is our first live one, but we're already planning our second one. Our next live episode will be on June 14th at 30. Topic will be in the CESO Communications e-newsletter. If you are not getting that newsletter right now and you'd like to sign up, you can shoot anybody that you see today an email, and we'll get you added to that list, and we'll have some information towards the end about contacting us to get onto that e-newsletter. But I think it's time we should go ahead and introduce our guest and get rolling on this great topic that we've got today.
Well, and let me first start by introducing you, Justin. Justin is a communication strategist for CESO. He is a former educator. And after 8 years of working in school communications departments in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas, he joined us in July of last year. He's been recognized by the National School Public Relations Association and the Texas School Public Relations Association for his work in social media and video production. And he won the 2020 TSPRA Bright Idea Award for his podcast, School PR Happy Hour.
That's me.
Yes, thank you. Let's also introduce Jim Cummings, who is one of our CESO senior strategists. Jim is accredited in public relations. He has more than 36 years of experience in school communications. He served twice as president of the Arizona School Public Relations Association. He served as the NSPRA Southwest Region Vice President, and he served as NSPRA President in 2014-2015. He has won numerous ASPRA and NSPRA awards, including the Barry Gaskins Mentor Legacy Award in 2012. He's been a senior strategist with CESO since 2020. And our very own Julie Thanem. Julie is accredited in public relations and has more than 32 years of experience in school communications. She's a past TSPRA president. She's a recipient of TSPRA's Bright Idea and Most Valuable Member Awards, and she currently serves TSPRA as interim executive director. She's also a past NSPRA president and received NSPRA's highest award, the President's Award, in 2022. She's been a senior strategist for CESO Communications since 2021.
Awesome. And I'll introduce Nicole, because I've said it every time. It's really awkward to make someone introduce themselves. So Nicole is a senior strategist for CESO Communications. And before joining CESO, she was responsible for communications in a district in Kansas City, Missouri for 23 years. She served as NSPRA president last year and served as MOSPRA president almost 20 years ago. She earned the NSPRA Gold Medallion and the MOSPRA Professional of the Year Award in her previous districts. So welcome, everybody. This is the point in time where I go backstage and just watch for questions and hang out. And if I see anything, I'll let you know. We'll shoot some questions in, but y'all have a great session and great conversation.
Thank you, Justin. All right. So let's start off with our first question that we hear a lot from people, and that is, how do they prepare? How do you prepare for a crisis? Jim, you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think the first thing you need to do is actually define what a crisis is, because that's not as easy as it sounds. What might have been a crisis a number of years ago really isn't anymore, because we were able to handle things so quickly. But I'll give you an example of how to define a crisis here. And this actually comes from my friend Julie. And the example is a crisis is any event, issue, or situation that threatens to undermine the relationship between your school or district and one or more of its stakeholders. But within that definition, you also have to, I think, define levels of crisis. And that's going to vary in almost every situation. Does a crisis at an elementary school translate as a crisis at a high school? And the answer to that is not necessarily. So what I recommend is, in preparation, is to create a scenario playbook. This allows you to flesh out policies and procedures you need to have in place before a crisis even occurs. It also gives you time to think about how to respond quickly, how to minimize damage, and address the four behavioral reactions that are very common to crisis. And those reactions are generally fear, anxiety, confusion, and in the worst case, intense dread. And then ask yourself, what kind of crisis can my school or school district face? How can we respond, and who's going to take action? So, but also, as you prepare all this and you're thinking about this, beware of the crisis cycle. That you want to prevent crisis, you want to mitigate them, you want to prepare for them, respond, and then you want to recover. So after you think about all that, and that's a lot of thinking, a lot of note taking, a lot of research, then you draw up a plan.
I think too, one of the things to keep in mind is that, this is a really busy time of year for our school PR folks and for superintendents and leadership teams across the nation. But you're coming up on a time where you have a little bit more breathing space in the summer to be proactive. And I think the summer offers really great time to take a look at your written plan, take a look at some of the things you're doing in your district. And I know a lot of times, Nicole, we'll get questions from some of our clients or from districts that will ask us, that they're not really involved in the crisis planning in their district. And I think right here before the start of school, as Jim says, there's lots of things that you can look at to see what your district is doing. And I think that back to school time is a perfect time. If you have a safety and security committee, if you have a safety survey, anything like that that's been out in your district, it's a good time in the summer to review that, update your crisis contact sheets, those types of things. So all those are things that you can do to prepare in advance. And the back to school time makes a perfect time for you to be able to do that.
Well, and like you were just sharing when we were talking before the webinar started, Julie, if you don't have a seat at that table, maybe invite yourself to that table, because it's important to have the voice of communications as part of that communication and crisis communication process at the planning stage. So we've been talking a little bit about planning and having a crisis plan. So let's just tackle that head on. What should be in your crisis communication plan? Julie?
Well, I think that one of the things you have to be aware of, you have to do the 4-step process. And that's what we always encourage. That 4-step communication process is to research, to plan, to implement your plan, and then to evaluate your plan. The research, state and federal requirements. Districts are required to have some things, and sometimes people confuse an emergency operations plan with a communications plan. But I know for the districts I worked in, they were the same thing. There was a communications component to the emergency operations plan. It was required by the state. So look at what your state and federal requirements are, what you have to have. I know to be able to receive federal funding, your plan has to have the information from FEMA about being able to figure out who's in charge when, right? And so incident command, if you're not familiar with that, is a part that has to be required in federal plans to be able to receive federal funding. So there are going to be things that your state requires and that that your federal requirements need to appear in there. But the basics of a plan, as Jim said, a lot of times it will include prevention strategies, mitigation, preparedness, your response, and your recovery. During response, that also includes reunification. I think you want to involve your local emergency responders. Your key stakeholders need to know that you have planned with your local and county officials, whether that's fire, police, first responders, some of the agencies that are available to you in a mass crisis situation. But a lot of crises are handled just by the school district. And it's really important, though, to communicate with those agencies so they know how you're going to handle a situation. And it could just be something as simple as working with City Works or the local transportation or the city manager, the mayor, who may put out information when the school has a crisis. So coordinating with all those individuals as part of your communications plan is very, very important. I think the incident command roles and responsibilities, but also even less formal than that of incident command that the federal government requires would be just who needs to know what when. And I think your plan ought to outline who's going to be in charge, who's going to be the spokesperson, who's going to handle communications in the middle of a situation. And so a lot of times a district's communications plan for crisis will include a basic plan that's emergency operations. It'll have annexes like what to do in the event of a tornado or what to do if there's a fire at the building, those types of things. How are you going to transport if you have to transport students off campus? Those annexes can kind of explain that. You might have something that's in the appendix, like it might be a map of the building, or it might be a phone tree that you have in communications at a particular campus, if in case your communications go down and technology is not available to you. A lot of the plans need to have now continuity of services. And in a lot of requirements, your communications and crisis plans have to have a pandemic piece to it. I know we all came off of that, and there were a lot of districts that were prepared, but others that were kind of scrambling to add that health pandemic into their crisis plans at the time. And so, like I know in the state of Texas, it's now required. I mentioned reunification. This is so important because you need to know how you're going to reunify parents with their students if you remain on campus, and also if you've been transported to another off-site location where the reunification is going to happen. So having that spelled out in the plan ahead of time in your communications plan is very, very important, and being able to communicate that with your parents. And I know a lot of districts and the state requirements now require an active shooter plan in your crisis communications plan. How are you going to handle an intruder on campus in an active shooter situation? And media guidelines, whether that's working with the regular media, the journalists in your area, whether that's print or radio or TV, but also social media. What are the social media guidelines in a crisis? Are you going to use your social media or not? And then some districts have MOUs, those memorandums of understanding that you have with agencies like Red Cross and other places. And that is when your buildings are going to be set up to triage or to be receiving others in the community if it's a weather hazard or something that has impacted other buildings. And so a lot of times those MOUs will be in there as well. So I think it's the communications planning can be overwhelming, but there are a lot of states that offer, and I know Texas is one of them, and I just give this as an example. The Texas School Safety Center has a website, and all the materials are free. So you do not have to be from Texas or in Texas or have a login to be able to access that. And the legislature in Texas has made all of those plans. So you can actually go and download a plan, and it's for free. So there are templates in there for transportation, for communications, for some of these other things. So that's kind of a long answer, but they have to be pretty comprehensive nowadays. And those communication plans have to be effective.
Yeah, they do. And I think just to add on to that, Julie, the Arizona Department of Education also has resources like that where you can download several different types of plans to go in there. And again, you don't have to be a resident of Arizona. You can just go in there and hit it. But I think part of the other thing that needs to be included in plans, and that really leans on the communication end of all this, is to have response procedures and an activation protocol in place within the context of your crisis plan. And then you had mentioned, just not just get in contact with your local first responders, but have those people as your emergency contacts as well. And just one other thing I would add is that in every crisis, rather if it's big, if it's small, doesn't matter, or in between, always have a post-crisis assessment. Figure out what you did right, figure out what you did wrong, and what you can do better.
Yes, exactly. And Julie talked about including first responders in the planning process. One of the nice things about that is it develops the relationships that you're going to be able to build on when you actually have to put that plan into effect. So by going through who's going to have what responsibility, where's the staging area going to be, all of those things that it's good to have that collaborative conversation with, it is good to be able to push into that relationship when you have that sit down with them, and then you've got a place to start from when the crisis hits.
Yeah. And we used to, just as an example of that, we used to do, at two of the school districts I worked at, we always did tabletop exercises at every single one of our schools with the first responders in our area. In one school district, we actually served 2 cities. So we had to have, one meeting with one city, another meeting with another, and, but you need to keep up on that. So I agree, Nicole, that's terribly important to do.
Exactly. Another thing that's important is to understand that a plan, especially in a crisis, is just a starting place, and you're going to have to adapt. So one question that we get is, how do you adapt the communication plan to different crises? What do you say to that, Jim?
So actually, I think the basic structure that you put into your communications plan on how to respond, how to when to kick it in, everything, that should serve you well in all crises. That's your basis. That's your baseline. But it also has to be flexible enough, because every single crisis has its own personality. Whether it's a bus accident, a fight in a food fight in the cafeteria. I've had that happen to me a couple times, or something, a teacher passing away over the weekend, that type of thing. Your basic structure is really what's going to guide you throughout the whole thing. But this is also where defining the crisis early, before you even set your plan, comes into play, because it allows you to plan for how to react to these things and how to make the plan that you do put together fluid. So again, each crisis has its own personality. So you just have to ask yourself some questions as they come up. What level of crisis is this? Is this, a small crisis, a huge crisis, a medium-sized crisis, or is it a crisis at all? Assess the risk to your school and to your district. Determine the impact that this crisis may have. If it, for instance, if somebody rear ends your school bus, that's really not, that has an impact on those kids on the bus, right? It may have some impact with the media. You may have to do some interviews with that, but by and large, that really doesn't impact the reputation and brand of the school district, because it's not the bus driver's fault. It was just an accident that happened. In other incidences, like for instance, if a child brings a weapon to school, that may impact your reputation. That will impact your brand, because people will begin to ask questions. How did it get in? How was this allowed? All the questions that come up when crises like this hit. But then you have to plan your response from that. What is the proper response? You're not going to go all in on all crises. If the electricity goes out and you have to shut down a school because you don't have air conditioning in Arizona. That's important to have air conditioning, especially this time of year. And if the electricity goes down, you literally have to close the school, because you'd be surprised at the things that operate off electricity, like toilets,
Exactly.
The flushing. So you have to have the plan to respond to that. And do you necessarily have to? You can let everybody know that the electricity is down at Bob Williams School. But the real people impacted by this are the people at the school. So you have to determine how far that message is going to go out and what your response is going to be to those parents. Meanwhile, your response may be a little different to families outside of that school. And then review, and we talked about this earlier, review and update your plan as you go along, because every crisis is an opportunity for growth.
Exactly.
It absolutely gives you the opportunity to take a look at your plan, how it worked, and how you can take what you learned and apply it to the plan and update it, because these plans should never sit still. They should never, once you make a plan, they should never sit on the shelf. You should take them out frequently, just to take a look at what's going on, and you should take them out after each and every crisis to update them. And I'm going to repeat it. This is a repeat of something I said earlier, but I'm going to keep repeating it. Always debrief after a crisis. Determine what went well and determine what could go better.
You're so right about that debriefing, having that after action review every time and having that be a set part of the process is really crucial, because there's always something that you can learn. And that's where those changes to your plan should come from, is those lessons learned. Having some internet connectivity stuff going on, Julie, huh? Okay,
You're
good.
back.
Good timing.
Sorry about that.
No problem. One thing that we hear from people is who needs to hear first, because everybody thinks that they're the most important person to get the information first in a crisis. Who should get the information first in the crisis?
I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind is the nature of the crisis, and information should flow depending on the most immediate need. We always would tell our school employees, handle the emergency first and then communicate accordingly. So I think sometimes it's first responders. Sometimes your superintendent and the decision makers need to obviously be at the forefront of some of your first communications. And it kind of depends on your role on the crisis team, because if you are the spokesperson that's forward facing to the community, but you're not necessarily the one in the mix handling the crisis at the moment. I know in my district, I was in charge of safety. So I had kind of a dual role. And I know a lot of our communications folks and a lot of superintendents in various size districts, they do have kind of dual roles. They may be serving as the decision maker along with the team on that's happening right in real time, but they also may be responsible for getting that communication out to groups. So you have to think about, is it your superintendent, your board, some of the cabinet members who might be, if you need the transportation director, if you need gas shut off somewhere, it might be the maintenance director, campus administration, if it's happening at the campus, if something's happening off site or at an extracurricular event, it might involve the athletic director. So it's really kind of on a need to know basis, and the people impacted the most need to have the communications. And so if you think about that, if your crisis involves staff members on campus or students on campus, then the families of those individuals need to get information from you as quickly as possible. But you want accurate information to go out. So a lot of times districts will handle a crisis, and their immediate information that they get out is, Nicole and Jim, what we call a holding statement. That would be acknowledging we are responding to a campus. We have, reports of, this, that, or other, whatever's happening. And we will come back with a statement or let you know after we get the facts. And so you put out a holding statement. Some districts do that on social media. Some people don't. I can tell you that a lot of times people say, well, we handle internal communications and we send that out internally. And so they'll use like their systems for communicating with staff and parents. The problem is you have neighbors next to that school. You have the families of first responders. And so you have to really apply your communications. You got to be flexible, because you got to understand that the crisis may be growing bigger than one campus or one district, and it might be more of a neighborhood situation or a community situation, or God forbid, a state and national situation. I know we've all had those, we've watched those stories unfold that have quickly become national news. And I think it changes who gets information and how quickly you've got to get that out. So you've got to think more than just internal communications. Of course, that's a very important piece to it, but it's also important to communicate to those that are most impacted by the crisis at hand. I will also say that we like to talk about the 3 C's of communication in a crisis, and the C is easily remembered because crisis communication starts with C's, but control, competence, and concern. So you want to communicate that you are in control of the situation. Now, I realize that you may not always be in complete control, and that is a process, but that you are managing the situation, and you want to let them know, because that builds confidence in you as leaders, and you want them to know that you're going to communicate with them when you have the facts. You want to communicate competence. that we've trained for this. We have plans for this. We have worked with our local and state agencies to handle such a situation, and we have competent people in charge of what's happening. And then also concern. It's that empathy that you want to communicate, especially if a crisis is impacting students, staff, the families of first responders. If there's been injured, or again, if it becomes even a situation where you are dealing with the death of students or staff, that's not necessarily something that you want to communicate right away, because there's a lot of different scenarios there. We used to say that, school districts will communicate that information afterwards, but it's really a doctor or a coroner that declares someone dead. So if you have information that you're giving out, you just want to show care and concern. And I know a lot of times school districts are not criticized for how they handled a situation. It's the lack of empathy that they showed in communicating it.
Right.
It's terribly
Exactly.
important. Yeah, I would also add, and I know this applies in Arizona, Illinois, and California, where we have separate elementary school districts from high school districts. You bet if you're in that situation, I don't know if that goes on in anywhere else other than those 3 states, but if you're in that situation, you also have to have your neighboring school districts on your contact list as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first people I would always contact would be the PIO at the high school district that served when I was working in my last district. It was an elementary district, and the person in the high school district was one of the first people I contacted, because it did have an effect at their schools, because the older siblings were attending those schools, or sometimes they'd have to walk by our campus to get through, to get home, and they may not be able to do that. So check and double check that list every single time. And, that's reciprocal as well. I know that the high school district was really great at working with us too.
Yeah, that's a good relationship to have. Another important relationship to have is with the local media. Hopefully you're just dealing with the local media. You may also be dealing with national or international, depending on your crisis. So what do you need to think about when dealing with the media during a crisis? Jim?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that the media is not your audience. They're means by which you're delivering a message. They are simply a conduit. They're not the guys you're trying to keep happy. It's your stakeholders you're trying to keep happy. And Nicole is right. Heaven forbid that your crisis reach a level where you're getting national attention. In that event, always prioritize your local media. Because remember, they're going to be around a lot longer than CNN. CNN will come in for a few days and then they'll leave, and then that'll be it. Meanwhile, the guys who you work with on a daily basis are still there. So always remember to prioritize them first. And so what you want to do after you develop your message, and you're going to want to do that in tandem with the rest of your crisis communication team, is to answer the questions they pose, but focus on the messages you want stakeholders to hear. We all have been through media training where we talk about bridging. Bridging is never more important than during a crisis, because you have to absolutely assure that the messages that you need to get out are getting out to your stakeholders, and that those are the ones that they want to hear.
Jim, can you go into that a little bit for if there's anybody watching that doesn't know what that is?
Yeah. What a bridge is a reporter will ask you a question, and basically you can answer it briefly, but you step in, you do a but, yes, we're doing this. However, we're also looking at A, B, C, and D, so that you can get, and those A, B, C, and D are your talking points, or the messages that you've established with your crisis communication team and your crisis team. And but you have to, and again, I want to emphasize that you don't do those alone. Even though we're experts in communication, you need to work with everybody on that communications, on the crisis communications team and the crisis team, to develop the appropriate messages and talking points. And so, and then after you do that, you have to identify the appropriate spokesperson. Frequently, it's the school communicator. I can't tell you how many TV interviews I did too many. If I never do another one, I'll be really, really happy. Because, it's just, you just have to do it. But again, you also have to be aware of a few other things. Honor the deadlines, especially with print and broadcast media. They some media, radio it's just kind of continuing. TV can kind of be continuing too, but we all know that they have deadlines for the 4:30, the 5, the 6 o'clock news. We know what the deadlines are for our partners in print. You need to be accessible to them because otherwise they're going to find somebody else to talk to, and they're not going to have the messages, and they're not going to have the talking points that's been developed. So make sure that you're always accessible to them, and know what's best for your students and stakeholders before you go out there. And again, as Juliet said, empathize whenever possible in speaking with the media. I can recall just doing things, they would ask a question, and I would actually just bridge a meeting and say, before we get to that, let us, just want to talk about our concern for our children and families, that they're our first priority, and in this instance, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and then kind of move on, and it works from there. But again, emphasis on remembering that the media is not your audience; they're just a tool for you to get your message out.
I think too, one thing that always stuck with me with media training is to remember that the camera is always on. I think you have to realize that especially in a crisis situation, there's no off the record. There really isn't anymore, and you need to be prepared that everything you say and everything that you share is information that could likely get out to the public. And so if you have, you want to deal only in facts and not in what if. And so a lot of times reporters will ask you, well, what if this and what if that happens? And you really need to stick with the facts that you know. And if you call some sort of a press conference, or you call and say, I'll come back in 30 minutes with an update, even if you don't have new information, you need to follow through and come back and say, this is what we know right now. We did not receive any new information in the last 30 minutes. It kind of depends on the nature of the crisis. But if it's an ongoing crisis and it's something, you can share information little by little if you're able to do that. But the most important thing is that you deal in fact, that you remember that the cameras are always on. And as Jim said, the media is really there. Most reporters I've ever experienced in my career, they really do want to do a good job, and they want the truth to be out there. They want to have a good story. They want to have fact. Now, they all go about it a little different ways sometimes, but I think there was a lot of respect when school districts are dealing with a crisis by the media. They actually want to help you get your story out. And we've got lots of available tools to us. And social media, again, is another way. And I know that there are some districts that choose not to use social media in a crisis, but it is one of the fastest ways for you to put out some initial statements and point people in the right direction. Even if it's to say, please, check your email for more information about as the situation unfolds. So I think it's important to remember that it's most crisis there. You have to be flexible because they're changing moment to moment, and very rarely do you have the same information and the same facts at the beginning of a crisis that you have in the middle or at the end of a crisis. And we just have to understand. I used to use a lot of words that were more tentative, like based on what I've been told so far, or the situation as we know it right now. There are ways that you can phrase things that really help people understand that this is the information that we have right now, and decisions that the district's making is based on the facts that we now have. When those facts change, you might have to come back and give an update or new information.
Yeah, I want to circle back to something that you had mentioned, Julie, about social media, because a lot of times, especially now, news, a lot of stuff gets out on social media quickly, and I think while they're not a newspaper or a television station, they are media. It is media, and you really need to get on social media really quick. I was following online a crisis a few weeks ago during a school shooting. And one of the things that the district did, and I just started monitoring the hashtags and everything else, they were on Twitter like that. I mean, they were the first ones on Twitter. But what you saw after that is everybody followed their narrative. The messaging that they put out from the very start was what everybody else followed. Not only the school district, the school district obviously was consistent, but the first responders picked up on it, and all the broadcast media and the print media picked up on it as well. It was almost like, basically they in a lot of instances the media was tweeting. It was like they were copy and pasting the tweet from the school district. Which, if I'm sitting in that situation, I'm sitting there and I'm praising the media gods for that, but you got to get out there, and you got to get out there quickly. We could probably do a whole thing on social media and crisis community.
And someday we will.
Yeah, on that. But you got to be quick, and you got to be out there. And I don't know if the school district had someone specifically assigned to social media, but they did a great job. And then I went to their Facebook page too, just to see what was going on. And they did some stuff on their Facebook page, but where the crisis was happening was at a particular school, and that's where a lot of the information was coming out too. But it was all the same information, and they really got ahead of the game, and they dictated the narrative, and it was really,
and that's the
brilliant.
key. That's the key, is to be the first one to frame the story so that you can kind of frame the narrative for people. The first one to the audience is the one that gets to do that. And so, what you said about the media and them not being the audience is so key. There's so many times where you're faced with a reporter who is saying, here's my questions from their perspective. And you've got to remember that your answers are not to the person you're looking at, but to the person at home who's your audience. And they'll say at the end, they always ask, is there anything else I didn't ask you? Is there anything else you'd like to share? And that's where you think, what did they not ask that my parents will ask? And use that opportunity to answer those questions. And we got a good comment on the YouTube from our friend Eric Steckling in Illinois. And he said, yes, as someone that was in the media, if you engage, it can actually be beneficial. Otherwise, they will say you had no comment or didn't cooperate, which is not the best look at times. And he's very right about that. You've got to, if they're going to do the story, you should be a part of it.
I think
that's
so.
Never a good look in a crisis.
It's key to point out that those relationships are not built in the middle of a crisis. Those things are things that you do year round, and you build those relationships with your reporters and with your local media. And yes, you, depending on the nature of your crisis, you could end up with media covering you that you don't have those relationships with. But as Jim said, it's really important to take care of your local media because they're going to be there. You've built those relationships with them. And, I remember always telling our reporters that we cover our districts, I will always tell you the truth. If I can't answer because of a particular reason or I don't know, I will research it and find out and get back to you. And they knew that I would do that. So I think it's important for you to build those relationships all year long. And when you've got a communications program that involves key stakeholders and involves the media as a partner in your district, and I know not everyone has that relationship with their media, but working towards that can really help in a crisis. And back to the point about social media, it's such a tough thing because I know after the pandemic, a lot of social media got very toxic for districts. A lot of districts turned off comments, and I do not believe that you have to answer every question or comment, especially in a crisis. In fact, I think that can have a bad look, like you're not focusing on first things. I think that social media can be a place where you quickly post statements, and as Jim said, you get to frame and be the one that then the news media and other families will pick up, but your families are going to be on social media whether you're there or not. And so I really challenge the idea that you don't need to use social media at all in a crisis and only use your internal communications, because more times than not, if you really stop and look at nearly every situation that you're dealing with in a school has some external factor, some audience or key stakeholder that has a need to know or is curious about that. And it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to show and put your plans in place and things that you have prepared for, and the communications and the relationships, standing up and doing a press conference with the police chief or with your first responders, or having the principal stand, next to someone that the fire chief, and talk about how it was handled, and the cooperation that handled, all of that builds trust with your audience, and it shows that you were prepared. And I know we can't be prepared for every single scenario, but as we, one of the things, and I know I was offline for a little bit, but the 5 different kind of main responses that you have is that you're going to secure a building, right? Stay safely inside. You're going to lock down a building. You're going to evacuate. You're going to shelter, or you're going to be in a hold. And those are kind of the main. And there's variations of that from state to state sometimes. But we're trying to get a common terminology and language, so that our parents know. And hopefully you've done that ahead of time. You've communicated with parents. This is what each of these mean. So when you go on social media, and we really encourage our clients to have an active social media plan in a crisis, a hashtag that you use that tells people, oh, wait, to your key stakeholders, this is a serious crisis situation.
I want to circle back to
communicate that ahead of time.
I want to circle back to something you just said, Julie, about language, because it really is critical in defining the terms. I think for a long time, a lot of us just use the term lockdown for anything that, if you lock the doors to the front of the school, but the kids are still moving around and everything else. And in my last few years working for a district, I changed all that language in our crisis plan. I made a distinct difference, and our parents knew it because we communicated with them, between shelter and lockdown. A shelter is when something was going on in the neighborhood, and so we're locking it so nobody can get on or off the campus right now until the police say it's okay. And a lockdown was, a lockdown. Whereas before we just use those 2 terms interchangeably, and they're not. And I think especially now with a lot, with what's happened over the last 2 years in schools and some of the crises we've faced, I think it's really, really important to make those distinctions in your language. And that's one of the reasons you want to go back and take it, especially as you said earlier, now's a great time. Now that school's beginning, it's almost out for a lot of people. Go back in there right now, adjust the language in your crisis plan. And when you do that, though, do not forget to communicate with your parents. Add it to your handbook if you have to. Have special posts on social media. Add something to your website so that they understand the language that's coming at them during a crisis.
Exactly. And a lot of what we've been talking about has been consistent over time. These things have been true when I started in school PR in 1999, and they've been true when you guys started. But some things have changed over that time as the world has changed. So let's talk a little bit about over our careers, what has changed as we respond to crisis situations?
I think that's Julie? A great question. And the really good part of this is that you're looking at 3 people that span about 3 decades of change, right? So our school PR careers are not short. We have the advantage of seeing different things evolve. I think some of the requirements coming down from the state and federal government, those have changed, I think, depending on what we've learned. I always read reports. There are typically public reports that you can either request or made public after a major incident that a school district has handled, whether that's a school shooter situation or a catastrophe like Hurricane Katrina or those types of things. We've learned through the years to be able to get those reports, learned what went well, what didn't go well. And so I think that more information being available to us now than ever before. We're not on an island and operating in silos. I think another thing, sadly, that has changed over the course of our careers is the frequency of active shooter situations and mass casualty incidents at schools. And that has changed and frames a lot of the way we handle our crisis communications. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I think all 3 of us can remember the moment the news started coming out when our friend Rick Kaufman was dealing with in Jefferson County with Columbine, and that kind of was a very eye-opening experience for a lot of us in the school business, and it really kind of changed the way even law enforcement is supposed to handle an active shooter situation. And so we have learned things through the years. Another example would be recently here in Texas, almost a year ago, coming up here this next week at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, just a very tragic situation. And I think that just even holding statements and what we might put out initially has changed, because you get that first word that things are under control, and then things can drastically change pretty quickly, and people hold you to what you said. And so I think even we're being careful about saying all students are safe and secure until we absolutely know that they are. And just because you've moved into procedures where someone's communicating that things are okay doesn't mean in another part of the building that they're not. And I think that's a very, very hard thing, but it's something that's changed through the years. One of the really good things that's changed is our method of communicating. The technology has evolved, and most of us have mass notifications that are not a phone tree. And if you're the letter Z and you're waiting to get the call about bad weather or whatever, it's not like that anymore. And so these mass calling systems and the ability to text parents and to have that kind of communication, even apps that companies, when some of our partners in our state chapters and the National School Public Relations Association, some of those corporate partners have tools available that districts can partner with and can get information out faster and more effectively than ever before. So cell phone use and technology, think about it, all the students who have cell phones. So initially you used to be we used to send out stuff to our staff that was the first to know. It's very difficult to make your staff the first to know something anymore because of cell phones and people that are videotaping on site, sending messages out to their parents, communicating with their parents. And so cell phone use, and kind of everybody is a mojo, right? Mobile journalists, and they're able to take video and upload that video immediately to their TikTok or to their Instagram or social sites. And so that has changed the nature of our ability. We have to learn to react very quickly. And then it can't be overstated enough how social media has changed all of our jobs. Immediate access to information, and more importantly, the access to misinformation. We spend a lot of time in the school business now, more than ever before, more than we did 20, 30 years ago, dealing with tracking down misinformation, rumors, and even disinformation, information that people have purposely put out that is wrong, that we now have to spend time to go back and correct, research, identify if it's accurate or not, and then try to go back. And so schools are being held accountable more than ever before for the way they respond, how fast they respond. And we live in an instant gratification society. And so that's a piece that has made our jobs in school communications and jobs for our superintendents very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, I just read an article maybe 2 days ago, I think it was in PR Daily, that there are three things in dealing with social media, that there are three items to consider when evaluating how an issue or narrative may impact your school district or your brand. One is, I think veracity is one. Is the narrative based on truth or falsehood? Velocity, how quickly is this taking off? And then the third was narrative, is it helpful or damaging to your district brand? And I think those three things alone absolutely dictate to you that you have to get on the social media very quickly during the crisis, because if you lose any one of those three, you're going to lose the battle for messaging.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really changed over time, in addition to speed and all of that, was expectations from our audience. So I had a situation where there was a bank robbery or something nearby several of our campuses, and we had to lock those down or put them on an external hold. And we did that. We communicated with the internal, external audiences for those campuses, and everybody was very satisfied with that communication and felt good about it. A year later, an almost identical situation happened where we had an issue at one of the schools that caused us to put all of the schools in that region on campus, same schools, same campuses. And we communicated in the same way. And people in other parts of the district were furious that they hadn't heard about this. Mm-hmm. And it took me a minute to think, why was it different? And what had happened in between the first situation and the second situation was Sandy Hook. Mm-hmm. And so these terrifying things that have happened have made people more alert and more attuned and more concerned for good reason. And so the expectations for who would find out had changed in that time. And so I learned the hard way in that situation that the truth from before was not the truth from today about our audience's expectations about who needed to know. And so I got much more broad with who found out when something was happening at a school.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think, you know, there have been a couple of game changers. Excuse me, in all this. I'm old enough to remember the first big publicity mass shooting or shooting in a school was in San Diego. And then, you know, the Irish band, the Boomtown Rats wrote, "I Don't Like Mondays." That's what that song is about a kid who just didn't like Mondays and decided to shoot up her school. She was across the street and fired into the schoolyard. Same thing happened a couple of years later in Paducah, Kentucky. And we were all at the time just shocked at something like this. But you know, two game changers. You know, game changers came along after that. Columbine just changed everything, because then the shooter was in school. Sandy Hook took that up a level. Because, you know, no child dying is a good thing, but when you have a room full of first graders getting shot, that's a whole different, you know, that's a game changer. And then Uvalde was another game changer for all this. And I think after each and every one of these incidents, we've had to up our communication level for everything. And we've also had to learn lessons about what to say, what not to say. We used to, you know, people would call us during a crisis sometime and say, "Can you guarantee my kid's safety?" That was always when the questions came out. And you know, frankly, years ago, I mean, I'm talking many years ago, we used to say, "Yeah, you know, your kid's safe at school." You can't say that anymore. There are no guarantees. You know, you need to frame the answer to that question very carefully, and that, you know, yeah, we're going to do the best to protect our students and staff, you know, because that's our first priority. But there are no guarantees anymore with this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that's changed. I think one of the other things that's changed the game was COVID, because remember, you know, for the last few years, school district, it was like crisis it was crisis mode for 3 straight years. That's why a lot of our colleagues are very tired right now. But that changed things. And what the dynamic that changed was the amount of information coming out from the school. And, you know, you can't, you know, we're not putting that genie back in the bottle. Parents now are expecting that level of communication from schools and districts that they did during COVID-19. And when crises when crises do hit, that's when they really expect to see that level of communication kick in. You know, again, that's just that genie ain't going back in the bottle ever.
You know, a couple of things that haven't changed that I think it's worthy of noting. One thing that hasn't changed is that the number one way that parents want to be communicated with by a school district is still through email. And so I think it's important to remember that you can be on social media, you can do some messaging that through other ways, but at the end of the day, they need to receive an email from either the superintendent or, depending on the nature of the crisis, could be from a campus principal. And I remind our campus principals in the districts that we're working with and CESO clients how important it is to make sure that they do a follow-up. Here's what happened. You might have read this, because there are a lot of people that aren't on social media. There are a lot of people that don't use that tool. And so you have to look at a lot of different methodologies, and that really hasn't changed. I think it also hasn't changed. You speak with one voice. I think it's very, very important that you know who your spokesperson is. And that doesn't mean that at moments that you don't put other people to the microphone or other people would send out communications, but you all need to be sure that you know, speaking for the organization, who's going to have that last word and kind of close the loop. And people really want to hear, how can we prevent this from happening again? And we got to remember that some crises are smaller crises. A water line break and all the kids can't go to the bathroom at school. That's a crisis for that campus principal and for those kiddos. And other things are one missing child that didn't get off the bus. And 99% of those stories come out okay, right? But in that moment, that is a crisis for that child's parents,
for sure,
for the school district, for the driver of the bus, those types of things. And so I think we got to really think about each individual. We got a situation and be flexible, but we got to close that loop. What can we do? And that's that evaluation piece. What did we do well? What did we not do well? And what can we do better or to prevent it next time?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, we did get a question. Our friend Eric asked us what happens when neighboring districts are either very communicative or not very communicative, and you're getting compared to them and their communications. So being able to kind of, like we talked about earlier, address people's expectations for communication.
I think it's important for you to be talking and collaborating with your area school districts. I think that kind of depending on your geographical area and what makes sense, districts that you're compared to, districts that have the same type of expectations and demographics, or as Eric brings up, just the people right around you. I think that, and I'm not saying necessarily that you have to communicate all the same and together, but when you're dealing with a situation where you're not putting out information and the people around you are, it stands to reason that you're going to draw criticism from that. So I think you have to have that collaboration happen ahead of time. I know in a lot of cases in the school world, districts come to the aid of other districts. If depending on how large the crisis is that you're dealing with, sometimes they will even send support, allow you to use buses. There are different things, and all that collaboration can happen ahead of time. And you just, I believe very strongly that a rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Exactly.
And so,
exactly. I had two situations in Missouri where there was a huge situation in another district, and we just went to them and helped. And that's the kind of collaboration that not just helps you with these little sticky issues of getting compared, but also in the worst case scenario, you've got more experienced hands there to help you out. That's a good point.
And to Eric's point, if you've communicated ahead of time to your parents, they know what to expect from you and what not to expect. Now they may have suggestions for you based on what neighboring districts around you have done. And you have to be open to that and listen to your key stakeholders and take that feedback. Hopefully it's constructive feedback, but I think it's really important for you to do all that ahead of time, and then your families will know exactly what to expect in a crisis. And and sometimes your team needs to know that too. We get a lot of questions. Wait, should the district communicate that or should a campus?
Mm-hmm.
And so learning the magnitude of a crisis and how many campuses it affects might pick in who's going to communicate about it. But it's highly appropriate sometimes for the communication to come directly from campus, especially in a large district. If a district that has 40, 50, or 100 schools is going to communicate every single time one of those schools has a situation, that's all they're going to be doing. And it's going to be giving the impression, right, that all they're doing is handling crisis. But we know in districts that large that you can actually funnel some of those responsibilities down to the campus level and just communicate ahead of time with your families on what to expect. Will that come from the principal? Will it come from someone at central office?
Yeah, I think one of the things that can help campuses, though, excuse me, I had an internet flip and I disappeared there for a little bit. But one of the things that you can have that communications team can do is put together a bank of letters, because there's a lot of these small mini crises, I like to call them, that happen all the time, and you end up having either send a letter or a text message home or an email home. Pre-write a lot of those. You can do it. Keep a file of all those letters or email messages that you've written. And just be able to adjust. Obviously, you're going to have to adjust the details in each of those depending on the crisis, but have a bank of those ready to save yourselves a lot of time. That way, not only is your messaging really consistent, it's easy to get out quickly. So
exactly.
pull that one.
So I really appreciate your time. This has been, I think, very helpful. And I appreciate the folks that were watching in live and the folks that are going to watch this later on video. Thanks to Eric for throwing us a question. And I hope everyone will join us for our next live episode, which is going to be 11 a.m. Central on Thursday, June 15th. We're going to be talking about branding. And if you want to learn more about CESO and about the services we offer to school districts, including communications, go to theceso.com. That's THECESO.com. And if you'd like to talk to us about providing communication support in your district or your organization, just contact our Vice President, Bob Noyad. His email is on the screen, or any of us on the team. Contact me or Julie or Jim, anybody you know on the CESO team. We'd love to help you. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.